Hello my dear students of grade 10, welcome to today's lesson. Today I am going to discuss with you all continuity of life. This is the 14th lesson of your grade 10 science textbook. So when we say continuity of life, in the previous lesson we have discussed different types of organisms. So you all know they all are part of the biosphere. So if this biosphere has to exist, and there should be various organisms, all these organisms should be there on Earth. So that is where they need to ensure that there is continuation of their life or continuity of life. So that means the existing generation should make sure that there is a future generation. They need to produce their offspring to make sure that the life continues on Earth. So to do that, there is the process called reproduction. You are familiar with this concept? All living organisms or characteristics of living organisms, one of the characteristics is reproduction. So in this lesson, we will be discussing different methods of reproduction shown by plants as well as man. So with that, if I move on to the contents, under continuity of life, we will be discussing what reproduction is. So reproduction, as I told you all, is a living characteristic or characteristic of living organisms, the process that ensures the continuity of life. Under that, there are different reproduction methods. So we will first look at the reproduction of plants, how plants reproduce by different methods. Then we will be discussing reproduction of man. And then we will discuss sexually transmitted diseases. So in man, the diseases related to the reproductive system or the diseases that are transmitted sexually. Those are the contents of the lesson. With that introduction, students, I will move on to the lesson. So here we will try to understand what reproduction is. Reproduction. The life process that gives rise to a new generation from an existing generation is referred to as reproduction. So there is an existing generation, the current generation, that has to produce the new generation. So that process that involves in the production of new generation from the existing generation is what we call as reproduction. So you all have to remember this explanation. The life process, that's one point, that gives rise to a new generation from an existing generation is referred to as reproduction. So under that, if we look at this, reproduction is a characteristic feature of organisms. We have discussed the characteristic features of living organisms. So reproduction is one such character. So characteristic feature of living organisms. It is essential to maintain the continuity of life. So that's an essential process that is needed to maintain the continuity. So from one generation, when a new generation is produced, then the life continues. So the species will exist on Earth. That is where we discuss continuity of life. So if we look at reproduction, this mainly takes place in two main methods. We have discussed this before also, students. You all can remember in the process of evolution when we discuss different groups of organisms. Normally, the primitive organisms or the organisms that evolve first, they show asexual reproduction. You all can remember that. But when the evolution happens, the evolutionary advanced organisms, they normally show sexual reproduction. So there are two main types, asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction, and sexual reproduction. So organisms reproduce either by asexual reproductive methods or sexual reproductive methods. We will now try to understand what asexual and sexual reproductions are. Asexual reproduction. So when we say asexual reproduction, students, it is the reproduction that takes place by either spores or vegetative parts of organisms. So when we say spores, you all can remember fungus, they reproduce by spores. Then some of the plants, the non-flowering seedless plants, they reproduce by spores. For example, Nephrolepis. So those are some of the non-flowering seedless plants. So those are a type of asexual reproduction shown by both plants and animals. The same way, if we consider vegetative reproduction, like vegetative parts, in a plant, if you consider the parts of the plant, you all know flowers are the reproductive structures present in plants. All the other parts, if they are used for reproduction, we call that method as vegetative reproduction. So, any part of a plant other than the flower, those are the vegetative parts, and in some of the primitive plants as well as other organisms, there is reproduction by spores. So, both those are considered as asexual reproduction. So, if we try to define what asexual reproduction is, reproduction that occurs by spores or vegetative parts is known as asexual reproduction. So, this asexual reproduction can take place in many different methods. So, under this, we will be discussing the different vegetative reproductions shown by plants, both by natural methods as well as artificial methods. So, with that introduction, students, I will move on to the next slide. Sexual reproduction. Now, when we say sexual reproduction, there should be two organisms involved, usually the male organism and the female organism. So, if we consider a plant, we have the flower, that is the sexual reproductive structure of plants, and in that there is the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system. So, there the process will be the sexual reproduction. The same way you all can remember the animals, sexually dimorphic animals, where you can identify the male organism and the female organism separately. So, those organisms, those animals and the advanced or evolutionary advanced animals, they reproduce by sexual reproduction, where you have a male animal and a female animal. The same goes for man. There is the male and the female reproductive systems which lead to the sexual reproduction in man as well. So, if we define what sexual reproduction is, we can say reproduction that occurs by the fusion of gametes produced by the male and female organisms. So, when we say male and female organisms, if we take the male reproductive structure and female reproductive structure of flowers, androecium and gynoecium. Androecium is the male reproductive structure, gynoecium is the female reproductive structure. So, in androecium, the pollens are produced, whereas inside the ovaries, that is the female reproductive part, the ovules are produced. Those are the gametes. So, the fusion of gametes, the ovules with pollens, the gametes of the pollens, That gives rise to the sexual reproduction. The same goes for animals. Eggs and sperm from man. So, fusion of an egg and sperm to produce the zygote that develops into a fetus. So, that process is the sexual reproduction. So, under this, if we look at the structures that are adapted for sexual reproduction can be found in evolutionary advanced organism. This I mentioned to you all. Evolutionary advanced organism. So, normally the asexual reproduction is more common in primitive organisms, whereas the sexual reproduction is more common in evolutionary advanced organisms. So, in plants, as I told you all, the gametes. What are the gametes? The pollens and the ovules. So, in plants, gametes are the pollens and ovules. Whereas in animals, if we consider in man, eggs and sperms. So, when these fuse and give rise to the new generation, we call that process as sexual reproduction. I am sure you all can understand the two processes. So, if we consider the asexual reproduction and the sexual reproduction methods, in an asexual reproduction method, only one organism is needed because there is no need for the gametes. So, because of that, from one existing organism, a new organism can be produced. So, that happens with just one organism. So, when two gametes fuse together, there is a mixing of characteristics. So, that happens in sexual reproduction. Whereas in asexual reproduction, you have only one organism, that is the existing organism. From that organism, new generation is produced. Because of that, there is no new characteristic produced in the offspring. So, that is why during evolution, it so happened that the sexual reproduction method developed so that it can give rise to changes, variations, so that new species will form and the evolution process will continue. So, that is the introduction to both asexual and sexual reproduction. Now, let us try to understand the difference between the two methods. So, here we will try to understand the differences between sexual and asexual reproduction. So, I have made it easy so that we can look at the differences based on these concepts. The first one, number of parental organisms. As I explained to you all students, there is one existing organism that will be the parental organism. From that organism, new organisms are produced. So, for asexual reproduction, only one parental organism is involved. So, here we can say contribution from only one organism. But in sexual reproduction, there has to be a male and female organisms. So, there needs to be two organisms involved. We call them the maternal and paternal organisms. So, here we can say two organisms are involved. One is known as the maternal organism. The other one is known as the paternal organism. So, like the mother and father, maternal and paternal, or female and male organisms. Then, if we look at the characteristics of offspring. Now, here there is only one organism, one parental organism in asexual reproduction. So, obviously, the offspring will resemble the parental organisms. So, they will be more or less same as the parental organism. So, characteristics of offspring more or less similar to the parental organism. So, under sexual reproduction, since it's the involvement of two gametes, that is the male and female gametes, the characteristics will be a mixed characteristic, or we can say mixing of characteristics. Mixing of characteristics of both parental organisms. Then, if we consider the next one, gametes. During asexual reproduction, as I told you all students, only the parental organism is there. Usually the reproduction occurs by either spores or vegetative parts. So, because of that, gametes are not produced. So, here gametes are not produced. Whereas in sexual reproduction, there should be the maternal and paternal organisms. So, therefore, the male gamete and the female gamete should fuse for the reproduction to take place. So, here we can say fusion of the male and female gamete. So, that occurs in sexual reproduction. Then if we take meiosis, what is meiosis? You are familiar with this process? The cell division. Cell division in which the number of chromosomes is halved is known as meiosis. So, what is the cell division in which the number of chromosomes remain the same? It is mitosis. So, mitosis takes place in both asexual and sexual reproduction, because you all know normally growth and development involves mitosis. But meiosis takes place only in sexual reproduction. Why? This happens when gametes are produced. Inside the male and female reproductive system, when gametes are produced, there is the occurrence of meiosis. So, there the number of chromosomes. If it is a diploid cell, it becomes a haploid cell. You all can remember in man, there are 23 pairs of chromosomes in the somatic cells. So, there when the gametes are produced, the sperms and eggs, the chromosome becomes half. So, there will be only 23 chromosomes. So, when the gametes fuse again, the new organism or the offspring will have the same number of chromosomes as the parental organism. So, because of that, in sexual reproduction, there is meiosis taking place. Whereas in asexual reproduction, there is no meiosis. So, here we can say meiosis does not occur. Whereas in sexual reproduction occurs. Then the next one, new species. Is there a chance of new species forming during asexual reproduction? No. Why? If you look at the characteristic of offspring, they are more or less similar to the parental organism. So, when you get an offspring that is similar to the parental organism, that means there are no new characteristics produced. So, that means there is no chance of new species being produced during asexual reproduction. But when there is meiosis taking place during the production of gametes, you all can remember the term variation or mutations in the chromosomes. Mutations are the changes. Due to that, new characteristics will form. So when new characteristics form, there is a chance of new species being developed. So here, during asexual reproduction, there is no possibility of formation of new species. But in sexual reproduction, new species can be produced. So here we can say new species will not be produced. Not be produced. Here, new species can be produced due to variations. Then we have few more differences. Number of offspring. Now, if we take the asexual reproduction as examples, we consider the spores and the vegetative reproductive parts. So, there it is easier to produce many organisms, many offsprings during a short period of time. So, during asexual reproduction, if we consider the number of offsprings, a large number of offspring are produced during a short period of time. Whereas if you consider the sexual reproduction, now you all can think of these students. If you think of the primitive organisms, now from one organism, many organisms are produced at a time. Whereas if you take the sexual reproduction in evolutionary advanced organisms like man or the other animals, the number of offspring produced at a given time is somewhat limited. So, it takes a longer time, or we can say less number of offspring are produced during a certain period of time. So, that is a difference. Number of offspring, a large number of offspring produced in a short time period. During sexual reproduction, less number of offspring are produced. So, less number of offspring are produced. Then we have the last difference. In what organisms do asexual reproduction occur? As I have been telling you all, the primitive organisms. When we say primitive in the evolutionary process, the organisms that evolved earlier, which are less developed, are usually known as the primitive organisms. So, asexual reproduction is very common in primitive organisms. But as I told you all before, students, the vegetative reproduction, that can be observed in highly developed or evolutionary developed plants as well. So, asexual reproduction occurs mostly in primitive organisms. Whereas sexual reproduction occurs in evolutionary advanced organisms. Is this clear to you all now? So, if we look at the differences, if we take the asexual reproduction, we only need one organism. So, there is contribution from only one organism, that is the parental organism. Whereas in sexual reproduction, two organisms are involved in the production of offspring, the maternal organism and the paternal organism. Then if we look at the characteristics, the offspring are more or less similar to the parental organism in asexual reproduction. Whereas in sexual reproduction, there is mixing of characteristics from both maternal and paternal organisms, or we can say parental organisms. If we consider the gametes, in asexual reproduction, there is no gamete production. Whereas in sexual reproduction, fusion of the male and female gametes takes place. Then if we consider meiosis, meiosis does not occur in asexual reproduction, whereas meiosis occurs in sexual reproduction. Then if we consider the formation of new species, because there is no meiosis, there is no mutation, there is no variation, because of that new characteristics are not produced, therefore there is no chance of new species being produced. So, new species will not be produced during asexual reproduction. Whereas in sexual reproduction, new species can be produced due to variations. Then if we consider the number of offspring, we can easily get a large number of offspring during a short period of time if there is asexual reproduction. But in sexual reproduction, less number of offspring are produced within a period of time. Then the last one, if we consider the organisms in which asexual reproduction takes place, usually it is seen in primitive organisms, whereas sexual reproduction is seen in evolutionary advanced organisms. So with that, students, I am sure you all can understand what asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction methods are and the differences between the two methods of reproduction. So with that introduction, now I will move on to the next slide. Reproduction of plants. So first we will try to understand how plants reproduce. Reproduction of plants occurs in two ways. So as I told you all before, flowers are there in plants, mainly the flowering plants, you are familiar with that, and flowers are the reproductive structures of plants, and in that I told you all about the male reproductive structure, the androecium, and gynecium, the female reproductive part. So there the sexual reproduction can take place. But at the same time, you all have discussed this in the smaller grades also. You all can remember plants can reproduce by roots, leaves and their stem, mostly the overground stem or even the underground stem. So those are parts that are known as vegetative parts of a plant. Parts other than the flowers are known as the vegetative parts of the plant. So these parts lead to reproduction. Then we call that as vegetative reproduction. So plants can either reproduce by vegetative reproduction or asexual reproduction. Otherwise, they reproduce by sexual reproduction. So both methods are seen in plants. So here we can say reproduction of plants occurs in two ways, asexual or vegetative reproduction. And we have sexual reproduction. So both methods are possible in plants. With that, we will move on to the next slide where we try to understand these two methods in more detail and also under vegetative reproduction. There are different methods. We will try to discuss them and understand them as well. Asexual reproduction or vegetative reproduction that is seen in plants. The process of generating new plants from underground or aerial parts of a mother plant is referred to as vegetative reproduction. So here you all need to remember these terms, underground or aerial parts of a mother plant. So, the plant that already exists, the parental plant, is going to be the mother plant. So, as you know, in asexual reproduction, only one organism is involved. So, only the mother plant is involved. If we take the mother plant, you all know about the root system. If it is a dicot plant, the taproot and the lateral roots. Then we have the aerial parts of the plant. So, here we have the stem, the leaves, and also the roots. So, again the stems, we can have the overground stem, overground, or I can say over the ground stem, as well as the underground stem. So, we have the leaves, the stems and the roots. These are all vegetative parts of the plant. So, if they involve in reproduction, they can be either underground parts or overground or aerial parts. These are the aerial parts. Aerial parts. So, then that reproduction is known as vegetative reproduction. So, this also can take place in two ways. It can be the natural reproduction that occurs normally, or we can carry out the vegetative reproduction. For example, we can consider the gotukola plant. There, the stem is known as the runner. It grows over the ground, and from different parts of the stem, you can see the adventitious roots forming. There, the new plants are produced. So, that is a natural vegetative reproduction by stems, over the ground stem, runners. But if you have a rose plant, if you cut off part of the stem and you replant it, then it is an artificial vegetative reproduction. So, under vegetative reproduction or asexual reproduction of plants, there are two methods. One is natural, the other one is artificial. Now, we will discuss those methods. So, there are two types of vegetative reproduction. So, here we can say there are two types of vegetative reproduction. One is natural vegetative reproduction . The second one is artificial vegetative reproduction. Or this reproduction can also be known as propagation. So, we can call it as natural vegetative propagation, artificial vegetative propagation. Both refer to the same thing, reproduction or propagation when it comes to asexual reproduction in plants. So, with that, I will move on to the next slide where I discuss the natural vegetative reproduction in plants. Natural vegetative reproduction. So, when we say natural vegetative reproduction, from the term, you all know students, it's occurring naturally, and also the vegetative parts of the plant are involved. Generation of new plants naturally from underground or aerial parts of a mother plant. Again, we use the term naturally here and from a mother plant. So, only one parent is involved. So, because it's only one parent, we normally call it as mother plant. There are so many vegetative parts. I told you all that the roots, the leaves and the stems can lead to vegetative reproduction. So, we will look at examples for each of these methods. The first one is roots. In vascular plants, what are vascular plants? You all can remember that. Plants that have a vascular tissue. Tissue differentiation, presence of vascular tissue, you all know it's seen in the evolutionary process. Even the non-flowering seedless plants, some of the plants, when it comes to ferns, there is tissue differentiation and they do have the vascular tissue. But in higher plants, the angiosperms, which are the monocots and dicots, there is a very highly developed vascular tissue. So, that is why we call them as vascular plants. In vascular plants, the roots are the organs of a plant that typically lie below the surface of the soil. So, when we say vascular plants, what are the vascular tissues? The xylem and the phloem. So, you all know in a normal plant, in a vascular plant, the roots are below the soil. And you all know the function of the root. Normally, they help the plant to hold on to the soil, and also they help or they actually absorb water and minerals from the soil. And through the vascular tissue, the xylem tissue, water is transported up. So, normally, if you look at a plant, the roots are ideally below soil. So, typically lie below the surface of the soil. But if you take certain plants, you would have seen this happening. Now, the mature plant, that is the mother plant, is in one place. This is the soil. But near the soil, you see another young plant growing. How is that possible? There are no seeds, no other structures, but you see another plant coming. That is because the root system here goes out of the soil and produces a new plant. So, the root that is present ideally below the soil gives rise to a new plant. You would have seen this in curry leaves, breadfruit, belly or wilworm plant. In all these, near one mother plant, the mature plant, you will see many small plants. That's because of the roots. So, that is a vegetative reproduction by roots. If we look at the examples, as I told you all, you can see the curry leaf plant. Normally near the large curry leaf, the mother plant, you can see very young plants. So, they are produced from roots, curry leaf. Then we have the breadfruit tree. You all know breadfruit, that also reproduces by roots. Then we have slime wood and blue lotus. In addition to that, you can see the belly or wilworm plant and the guava plant shown here. So, those also can reproduce by roots. So, I am sure you all can remember that from the smaller grades as well. So, that is the reproduction by roots. I will move on to the next slide. Here it is the reproduction by leaves. So, we have these examples. Begonia, here you can see students, these two pictures. This is begonia. Then we have Akapana or Sadai Karechan. This is Akapana plant. And here we have the queen of the night or what we call as Kadupul. These all reproduce by leaves. Now, if you look at these pictures, students, this is again a begonia plant. You can see the mature leaf. From this part of the mature leaf, you can see the smaller leaves being produced. So, they can grow into a new plant. That is how reproduction occurs in begonia. But if you take this one, the Akapana plant or even Bryophyllum, you all remember students, the leaves of Bryophyllum, the edge of the leaf has a shape like this. So, from these points, the roots can form and that can give rise to a new plant. From each of these points, new plants can form. So, they can all grow into new plants, or if we want, what we can do is we can cut. This is a natural process, but if we want the plants to grow in different places, we can cut off each of these parts and replant them in some other place. Otherwise, naturally, the roots form and all the plants will grow near the mother plant itself. So, you all have seen this happening. That is reproduction by leaves. Normally, the function of leaves you all know is photosynthesis. But here they can reproduce as well. So examples, begonia, acapana or sadaikarachan, queen of the night, that is kadapul. These are the examples. With that, we will move on to the next one, suckers. Now when we say suckers, these are small plants that rise horizontally from the basal part of the stem under the soil. Now if you take a banana plant or even a paddy plant, now we have the soil here, the plant is there. From here, another horizontal part that comes out from this stem, that is known as the sucker. That gives rise to this from what is coming from here is known as the sucker. That grows into a new plant. So here you can see small plants that rise horizontally from the basal part of the stem under the soil. That is known as the sucker. So here also you can see this is the paddy plant. So here you all can see, students, the paddy plants, they look as if they are all connected together. That is because they form from suckers. So that is paddy. Then here you can see the banana plant. If you look closely at this point, here you can see the mother plant is there and the young plant is there. So there it looks as if the stems are connected. The basal part of the stems are connected if you go there and look closely. That's because from the stem of the mother plant, the sucker comes out of the soil and that gives rise to the new plant. So that is in banana. Then here you can see the pineapple plant. They also reproduce by suckers. Then chrysanthemum. Chrysanthemum also reproduces by suckers. Then we have hulankiria. That is this. Hulankiria and kaladuru is this one. So those are also plants. Here you can see this part of the plant. That is by suckers. The horizontally it comes out. The stem comes out. So that is again an example for suckers. So these are vegetative reproduction by suckers. You all have to remember the examples. Paddy, banana, pineapple, chrysanthemum, hulankiria and kaladu. Those are the plants. With that, we will move on to the next one. Next one is runners. So when we say runners, plant stems that run along the surface of soil, connecting the stems to soil by adventitious roots. So here you all can remember, students, you can look at this as well. In this is the runner. This part is the runner. This is a gotukola plant, you can see. And these are the adventitious roots. Adventitious root. Adventitious roots. So the stem, that is the runner, it grows over the soil. Here also if you look closely, you can see they grow over the soil. And at certain intervals, you can see the new plants coming out. So there is a formation of adventitious roots. So plant stems that run along the surface of soil, connecting the stem to soil by adventitious roots. So that is known as runners. Examples, gotukola or vallare. This is a gotukola plant. This is also a gotukola plant. So this is how you see it from the top. This is how the runners act as reproductive structures. Then we have sweet potatoes. You can see the sweet potato plant here. Then Maharavana Raula or Ravanan Mesai. So that is also a plant that reproduces by runners. These are the examples. Over the ground stem. This is something important. They run along the surface of the soil. So I told you all about over the ground stem as well as underground stem. So this is an overground stem. That is why run along the surface of soil. Is that clear to you all? With that, I will move on to the next one. Next one is bulbils. What are bulbils? If you take a pineapple fruit, you see the crown-like structure. Like this, you see that structure. That is a bulbil. That can be used to reproduce the plant. So, special reproductive structure formed by a modification of a vegetative bud or a flower bud. That's very important. A modified vegetative bud or a flower bud. So, this part, the pineapple, if you look at the pineapple, here you can see this part is the modified bud. So, that is what we call as bulbil. If you cut that and plant it like this, that will grow into a new pineapple plant. So, this is how it is done. This is the pineapple plant. Then we have the jute plant there and hondala here. So, those are examples. Examples are pineapple, jute and hondala. That is for bulbils. Special reproductive structure formed by a modification of a vegetative bud or a flower bud. Is that clear to you all, students? So, then I will move on to the next one. Here we have underground stems. So, earlier we saw the over the ground stem, above the soil. So, all these stems are underground stems. So, they are going to be below the soil. Normally, stems grow above soil. Here, the stem is going to grow below the soil. So, under that, there are 4 different types. Stems of plants which grow under the soil are known as underground stems. And these underground stems have different functions. Vegetative propagation, storage of food, and spending dormant period in adverse climatic conditions are some functions of underground stems. So, vegetative propagation is what we are going to discuss now, producing new offspring by vegetative methods. Then storage of food. For example, if you take potatoes, they are underground stem. So, they store food. That's why we use them as yams. So, some of the yams, they have storage of food. And one purpose why the plant stores food is to overcome the dormant period or spending the dormant period in adverse climatic conditions. What is a dormant period? In a plant, if the growth, development or the physiological activities are temporarily stopped, or in animals, if the physical activities are temporarily stopped, then we call that period as dormant period. So, during that time, the plant tries to survive or spend the dormant period. That is when the environment conditions are adverse, not suitable for the growth of the plant. So, during that time, they exist under the soil in the form of an underground stem with food storage. So, they survive the dormant period and then they grow into a new plant. So, they just spend that adverse period, adverse climatic condition without growing. That is what we call as dormancy. You all are familiar with dormancy of seeds as well. That again to survive adverse climatic conditions. So, vegetative propagation, storage of food and spending dormant period in adverse climatic conditions are some functions of underground stems. Underground stems are categorized into 4 types according to the external feature. So, based on how they look like, they have been categorized into 4 types: rhizomes, corms, bulbs and stem tubers. So, rhizome as examples we can consider ginger, turmeric, cannas and aratha. Then we have corms, examples big-rooted taro yam, that is called habarala or neershambu, and cocoa yam, gahala or shambu. Then there is the taro yam and elephant foot yam. Those are all examples of corms. I will show you all the diagrams in the next slide, students. You all just look at the examples for now. Then we have bulbs as examples, red onion, big onion, leaves. And stem tuber examples are potato, coleus potato, that is innala. These are all different types of underground stems based on their structure. So, this is how we can identify these structures. If we take the rhizome, it normally grows horizontal to the soil. It is horizontal to the soil. It grows horizontally under the soil. Whereas if we take the corm, it grows vertically like this. If the soil surface is here, that will be the corm. Then if you take the bulb, you would have seen in onions, these are actually the fleshy scaly leaves, and we have this part, and from here you would have seen the growth of the roots. So that is the bulb structure. Then stem tuber, of course, potato at the end of the stem under the ground there is food storage like that. So this is the structural difference. Grows horizontally is rhizome. Grows vertically is corm. Then we have the bulb, the structure with the scaly leaves and all, and stem tuber, branching of stem, and the food storage at the end of the stem. So that is stem tuber. Now we will look at the diagrams. Here you can see, as I told you, ginger is an example of rhizome. Rhizome, can you see here? It grows horizontally to the soil. I have put the pictures also here, so you can look at both of those. This is the diagram of a rhizome. Here you can see ginger. Ginger, turmeric, all these are rhizomes. Whereas corm, can you see, students, it grows vertically like this. So here this is the structure of a corm. So this is again rhizome, a rhizome, ginger, then corm, the different types of yams or habarella. Here you can see cocoa yam, taro yam, all those are corms. Then here you can see how the onion grows. Now I told you all these are the scale leaves. Both of these are bulbs. These are the scale leaves, and at the tip you can see the adventitious roots. So that gives rise to the new plant. You can see here leeks, onions, big onions, all of them reproduce by bulbs. Here you can see the bulb structure as well. These are the scale leaves that store food, the fleshy leaves. And from here you can see the modified stem. Here you can see the formation of the roots. Then if you look at the stem tuber, can you see, students? The stem branches out, and here there are the food storage structures. So they store food, but when you keep them for a long time, even in your households, you would have noticed this. You can see the new plant trying to grow from the stem tuber. So there it acts as the vegetative reproductive structure. So this is a stem tuber, potato. Now can you all understand the 4 different types of underground stems? They have different structures. So rhizome grows horizontally, corm grows vertically, whereas bulb is this particular structure, and stem tuber is usually food storage and vegetative reproduction. So with that, students, we have discussed all the different types of natural vegetative reproduction seen in plants. Now I will move on to the next slide. So then we have an activity here, students. Observe the plants in your home garden or in school and identify that are propagated by vegetative parts. So far we have discussed the vegetative reproduction, that is the natural vegetative reproduction. Roots, for example, curry leaves, belly, guava, all those reproduce by roots. Then when we saw leaves, begonia, acapana or bryophyllum, all these reproduce by leaves. Then stems, under that we saw the runners. Over the ground, the runners, gotukola is a runner. Then we saw reproduction by suckers like paddy and all that. So thereafter we looked at the different types of underground stems, or before underground stems we discussed the bulbils like in pineapple and all that. Bulbils, reproduction by a modified bud, a flower bud or a modified bud. Then we discussed the 4 different types of underground stems, the rhizome, corm, then bulbs as well as stem tubers. So you are familiar with all these structures. If you look at a plant And if you see the new plant growing, from the way it grows and from the new structures, you all will be able to identify these different plants. So if you look at in your home garden around you all or else in the school, you can identify these plants. So as examples, I can consider the reproduction. I'll give you all just a table as an example. We can say roots. You would have seen the belly plant or wilbum plant. Maybe in your home garden or in school you might have the plant. Then it is reproduction by roots. If we take the reproduction by, let's say, stem, sometimes you will even see underground stem, you will be able to see maybe turmeric or ginger. All these are visible sometimes, or you all might have it in your garden. Sometimes you might even have onions in the garden. So then underground stem. Then if we take let's say the leaves, reproduction by leaves. So begonia is a common plant. Then even peperomia. You all would have seen peperomia plant. They also reproduce by leaves. So these are a few examples, students. If we take the overground stem runners, go to color. So like that, you can look at different plants in your environment and you can identify the type of vegetative reproduction. So observe the plants in your home garden or in school and identify that are propagated by vegetative parts. Identify the plants that are propagated by vegetative parts. Then you tabulate those plants and their methods of propagation. So that of course you can put it into a table. You can have 2 columns. This is something that you all know, students. I really don't have to do it out for you all, but just to show you all. Now you can make it into a table like that, where you have 2 columns. So here you can have the vegetative reproductive part, reproduction I'll say, and you can include them like leaves, underground stem, over the ground stem, you can include that, and the plants. So what I have written as examples there, you can put it into the table form. You can tabulate it. So in addition to that, you can include many more examples because you all see a lot of plants in your gardens. And I am sure some of you all are really interested in plants as well. So you are familiar with so many different types of plants. So you will be able to identify these different vegetative structures. So vegetative reproduction of plants. So with that, students, I have come to the end of this lesson. I have explained what reproduction is. Under that we looked at sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. It was just an introduction. Then we discussed the difference between asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. And thereafter, I discussed with you all the different types of vegetative reproduction seen in plants. And that also the natural vegetative reproduction. So in the next chapter, we will discuss the artificial reproduction methods or artificial vegetative reproduction methods seen in plants.